Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tania Marien. Welcome to the new year and part 2 of our look at how nature has influenced the lives of my guests. I have had the good fortune to interview more than 40 guests since launching the podcast 2 years ago this month. Guests have come from many disciplines, and what they share in common is their commitment to nurturing people's relationship with the outdoors and their status as independent professionals. In the last episode, guests shared their earliest memories of enjoying nature. Today, we'll hear guests talk about the moment nature became important to them. As was the case with guest responses to the previous question, themes also appeared in their responses when they thought about when nature became important to them. Some guests experienced a gradual realization of nature's importance. Author and botanical artist Rema Peterson explains that there were many stepping stones between where her thoughts about nature used to be and where they are now.
And I was just so enchanted by all this. So, plus I had the experience with Girl Scout camping. I even spent a summer in Colorado being a Girl Scout camp counselor after my first year of university. And then I had been in art for 2 years in university, and I was really disenchanted with how they were teaching it and forcing us into, some of the professors would force you into their own mold. And so I left art school. There were some really good professors too, but I didn't like being forced into someone's mold. So I was out of school for about a year, and then I had artist friends in Seattle. I was living there. And my really good friend, Melinda, had shelves of houseplants in her windows. And I was totally enchanted by all the different shapes and forms, which I hadn't seen before. Because when I was growing up, most of my ideas about plants were there was just grass, trees, petunias, and geraniums. And couldn't get interested in that. So there were lots of stepping stones on the way for me to make a real commitment to botany. And then I went back to school and I did a botany degree here at University of Alberta.
Professor Dr. Marika Hecht calls her appreciation of the natural world a slow awakening. Here she shares a story about the moment she became acutely aware of the ground she walked on, and when she became more aware of the trees in New York City.
So I went to college I grew up right in the heart of New York City, very, very urban. And then I went to college in a very rural community in Western Massachusetts. And that very first semester, my first year in this completely different kind of environment in every possible way, I was walking across the quad. It was kind of a traditional looking campus, and there was a quad. And I was walking on the grassy area, and I had this realization that the ground was hard beneath my feet, that it had frozen. And it was the first time in my life that I ever considered that the ground freezes, because I had been walking all those years on concrete. And from there, I just got more and more captivated with these things that I would notice about the natural world, the non-human natural world that had eluded me before. And so I continued studying science education. I ended up getting a master's in botany. I taught science in middle and high school. And then for about 15 years, I did informal environmental education and stewardship here in Pittsburgh, where I live now, which is a wonderful city with all the excellence of cities, but also all the many problems of cities. So it's a very interesting place to think about how the environment functions, both in terms of human and non-human natural communities.
When did you realize nature was important to you?
I think that story that I just told of walking across the quad was, one of those moments. Just going back to the article, one of the things that I learned in the article that was also true for me as you're asking me this question is that there was no single moment. These things they emerge over time, and they kind of different experiences intersect. And so I think for me, it was kind of a slow awakening. When I taught middle and high school in New York City, I went back home after college and taught public school. And I had the experience of having young people ask me questions about the names of trees. I taught science, and so they thought I knew everything about science, And I can remember in particular one young man asking me the names of the trees, and I didn't know the names of the trees. And so I started looking them up. I think that was the first field guide that I got. I was 25. So I was not young. I mean, I'm young compared to what I am now, but I wasn't like I was a child growing up knowing the difference between a maple and an oak. And I was adult already. And I think the first field guide I got was that Peterson's Guide to Eastern Trees. I still have it, I'm sure, on my shelf. And I just started trying to figure out what the street trees were in New York City. And from there, I got more and more captivated with trying to identify plants. I like to joke, as many botanists do, that plants are wonderful because they can't fly away. You can just sit there and key them out, and you can go back to the same place. If you don't get it the first time, you can go back and look at it in a different season. So they're a really nice place to begin your kind of naturalist endeavors, and then progress onto other kinds of taxa.
When reflecting about when nature became important to them, other guests cited life's stressors as factors that brought nature's restorative effects into focus. Author, biologist, and nature journaler John Muir Laws shared this story. When did you realize nature was important to you?
I think I always knew that I liked it, but it was in high school that I really discovered that I needed it. I was struggling academically. I've got dyslexia, and the tasks that you're being asked to do in sort of standard schooling, they're challenging enough as it is. With dyslexia thrown on top of that, I became convinced that sort of intellectually I didn't have anything to offer. And it was sad, it was difficult, it was depressing. And my solace, my kind of way to kind of reground myself, is that every day after school, I would take a detour through Golden Gate Park. And on my way home, I would wander around off trails in the park, looking for birds and kind of crawling through the brush, getting close to squirrels. And I had my little journal with me. So that would ride along in my backpack during the school day. And then once school was over, bringing that journal into the woods, well, even though it was fairly, the park is not totally wild, but there's some places that are kind of between the heavy management zones where you can find lots of neat stuff. And that's exactly what I would do. That's where I found that I would walk out of that park feeling calm, feeling grounded, just not knowing what it was, but knowing I liked that state much better. And I've been also keeping myself out in the woods ever since.
Poet and author Tina Demirjian credits her writing practice with helping her see nature in a new light.
There's that old adage, stop and smell the roses, right? But there's a reason for it, because especially now with all the social media, it's so easy not to be quiet. And I think that when I started to write, I started to pay attention to moments. And those moments happen so much in nature.
Another theme emerging from guest responses focused on the impact childhood experiences had on them. These guests cited field trips, outdoor educational experiences, and even an advocacy letter to President George H.W. Bush as moments when nature became important to them. Dr. Stephanie Dole, entomologist and founder of Beetle Lady, shares the experiences that changed things for her.
I had a wonderful experience. This goes back to what we were just talking about. So I grew up in Los Angeles in a really urban area. And then right before I turned 16, my parents announced that they had quite on impulse bought a house in Salt Lake City, Utah, and were moving us to Utah. They weren't even looking. They just bought a house while on a trip. And we moved there, and I ended up going to a school. The school was called, it still exists. It's a high school. Actually, it's a grade school through high school called Realms of Inquiry. And this school had a very strong outdoor program. And the outdoor program involved, you'd start the school year off with a 2-week backpacking trip. We would often go to the Wind Rivers Range in Wyoming. And we would also do a month in another country. So we did 1 month in Mexico camping and 1 month in Belize and Guatemala camping. And I think for me, so that was an amazing thing for me in that it turned me from a very urban young woman to a very capable camper, backpacker, hiker, much more comfortable in nature, which, fast forward to my career as an entomologist, I've worked in the Amazon, I've worked in Southeast Asian rainforests. So I don't know how I could have done those things without having that experience kind of leading me from being a very urban child to somebody who could camp and hike and all of those things. And those trips were huge for me, being out in real wilderness. They weren't, especially the backpacking trip, we were in actual wilderness, which was something I had never experienced before. And they had such a profound effect on me emotionally. I kept journals at the time. I still have them to this day. And for me, that was huge. And then adding to that, then getting a chance to actually visit a tropical rainforest in Belize and in Guatemala and see that sort of ecosystem and diversity was enormously life-changing for me. So I think in those experiences between the ages of 16 and 18 at the end of high school that just had a tremendous effect on me, realizing that nature was really important to me and was something that I had in its own version in Los Angeles. We went to the beach and things like that, but really have that understanding that wilderness exists and that nature exists in this much broader sense than a lot of us experience.
Through my conversations with guests, I've learned that realizing nature's importance doesn't happen as an epiphany. There isn't a single aha moment. I've learned that this realization occurs gradually over many years and in response to one's own life experiences. To learn more about the experiences of my guests, please visit the show notes. Here you will find links to the conversations shared in this episode. Again, it is impossible to include all of the stories shared by my guests, so I encourage you to listen to past episodes when you have the time. I've dedicated the last 2 episodes to my signature questions because I am retiring them and moving on to a new question. You'll hear this new question near the end of each episode moving forward. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast, Overcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the holiday weekend. I'm excited to begin a new year with you. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tania Marien.